Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 241. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Richie Billing about his new fantasy novella, Together We Rise, a story about revolution against a corrupt government in a world where life has become a fight for survival. Richie took inspiration from real-world events and the plight of many around the globe. This story is told from multiple points of view: workers, healers, children, police officers, criminals, and so on. Each chapter follows a different character, and the story unfolds like a baton relay race, with each character handing off to the next, chapter by chapter, until we see the entire story unfold. Richie also used AI to create a soundtrack to accompany this novella. In addition to his fiction writing, he is the author of A Fantasy Writer's Handbook and the host of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed podcast. In this episode, I'll chat with Richie about his writing journey, his use of what he calls gray characters, and why his advice to any writer is to be a sponge, as well as a few other things, coming up. Richie Billing, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you very much for joining me, Stacey. It's lovely to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your brand new book, Together We Rise. If you don't mind, tell us a little about this book and what inspired you to write it.
So, in short, it's about a revolution against a corrupt government. So there's a lot of that going on around the world at the moment. And I'm sure there's a few people listening who wishes it could happen in their own country as well. But it's something that's inspired by everything that's going on in the world, and I've been thinking about it a lot over the last 2 years, especially as we've seen things go a bit more drastic and definitely more unfair. And I think this is the whole point. It seems to be a bit of a theme throughout my life, is that I'm quite driven by injustice and unfairness, and I just want the world to be a happier and fairer place. So sometimes it feels like that's an impossible thing now, and when you see all these things happening and you experience them, you kind of feel a little bit helpless, especially as a writer. But the only thing I could do was to write about it, so I decided to try and tell a story that was about the issues that we're all going through, or that we see and experience, but take a step back from it and tell it from like a fictional perspective. Because sometimes I feel like if we just regurgitate what we see in the news, we're a lot of the time we're desensitized to that kind of thing anyway. But if we take a step back and tell it in a more creative and unique way that is more relatable and engaging, then you never know, you might get through to a few people.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, it's been quite a fun project.
Have you found that in writing fantasy that it's sometimes easier to engage people in conversation about the issues as long as they're in the story?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, maybe harder when asked about things that relate to their own life. It's much easier to talk about it maybe in the abstract or when it's happening on another world.
Yeah, and sometimes we have these problems and we don't actively seek out solutions, and sometimes when we're reading, we get these little gems, these little things that really chime with us, And I suppose that's what it is. It's just showing you the lives of other people that you hopefully can relate to in some way. And that's what I've tried to increase the relatability by introducing lots of different perspectives. And this is something that I took heavy influence from The Wire, the TV show. I don't know if you've ever seen The Wire.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I love The Wire. It's one of the best creative things ever like made for me because it does such a good job of looking at one issue critically from lots of different perspectives and showing you the impact. And that's what I wanted to sort of replicate here with like a sort of corrupt system that we see around the world and show the different perspectives from like the healers and doctors who have to sort of patch people back together. And then you've got like the workers and what life is like for them, increasingly worse, like the friends dying in accidents at work and stuff like that. And then you've got the children who are basically symbolic of the cycle because, like, you see a lot of what is to come in their lives, and nothing's getting better. So you kind of predict their future quite easily. And then you've got interesting characters as well, like the police officers who are just as corrupt as the criminals, and like the conflicts that individuals experience. Like not everyone's bad, but they're sometimes forced into these situations. And I quite like the grey characters in fantasy. I think that's one of my favorite aspects of it is that you can explore characters who have a foot in both sides, and it's interesting to see the different decisions they make when the back's against the wall.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your story reads a bit like, as I was thinking about it, sort of like a baton relay in many
Yeah,
respects. And you have multiple, each chapter is basically a different character. You see it from a different character's, or you're following a different character through the story. But you end up understanding what has happened through each of the sight line of each of these different characters. So maybe what you can do for us is introduce us to a few of the main ones.
yeah. I think the central character is Talia, or Till, as she's also known. And Till is a character I created about 10 years ago. And I've always had a bit of a soft spot for her. And she was featured in a novel that was the first novel I'd ever written, and it wasn't very good. The first chapter was 12,500 words long. So, but I like the concepts and stuff. And Till was one of the main storylines in that book, and I'd used a big chunk of another part of that story on something else, and I just had that story left, and I was like, "That's the best bit." So, and it was also a revolution. So, what Till's story is about is she's from this city of Pietalos where the uprising happens, and she's just the daughter of a blacksmith. She lives quite a normal life, but life is as obviously coming from a working class background, it's getting like steadily worse. And as her father's getting older, and he starts to worry about Till and her future, and at the same time, she starts getting swooned by this like handsome, high up police officer. So it's all looking rosy, but things take a really like a big dive for Till. It turns out the husband's like not. She ends up marrying this guy, and he turns into a really abusive, horrible person. And he's at the sort of core of the corruption in the city. So she's sort of driven to a point where she's just completely helpless, despondent. She later finds out that her husband orchestrates the murder of her father as a way of sort of controlling her even more. And she's just a shell of herself until one day she comes across a woman being assaulted by a police officer. And she ends up killing this police officer and feels a tremendous sense of power and control that things that like, she was like stripped of completely. And it sort of sets her on a path of vigilantism, and she sets out to try and rid the city of corruption. She's also really good with swords because her dad was a master swordsman as well, being a blacksmith. So she's pretty effective. But she soon realizes that it's not enough, and then she starts to begin to plan the revolution, and all that is backstory. But you find out what happens as you go, because what I wanted to tell quite a lean story, one that just gets you straight into the meat of the story. I don't want to show you a year of all the build up. I just want to show you the culmination of it all, and I'll tell you the necessary bits as we go along. But Till is a character that's present throughout the story, and she pops up in different forms. So she does have this vigilante persona called Shadow, and in some character, or from some characters' perspectives, they know her as Shadow, and other characters know her as Till. And then there's a bit of a reveal at the end where I didn't realize that I'd done this, but like people commented saying that was a really good reveal. That Shadow was, oh, I've spoiled it now, but I didn't know it was a thing anyway. So, um, but yeah, so she's the central character, and then you've got all the people that she sort of brings in to help. So she's got an old trusted advisor called Dice, who's like an old healer, and he's lived through a revolution before when they got rid of the king, and then they've got this government in which is sort of corrupted over time, and then they're going to overthrow that now. So, and then we've got Kishto, who's the police officer, who's very conflicted, and he has a choice to make between turning sides, basically. And then it does get very fantasy-ish at the end. And what I love about fantasy is it's just a big debate about good and evil, and looking at the different shades of it. And my whole sort of point in writing fantasy stories is to explore what is the nature of good and what is the nature of evil. And in my fantasy world, I see this as good is life and evil is nothingness, because they are the polar opposites, and they're in an endless struggle for control. And it's sort of that battle sort of filters down on lots of levels like a big onion. And the level that we're concerned with here is the human one, and the sort of decisions that people make and things like that. So in this last chapter, we get to see more of the sort of the more evil forces at work behind, like who's orchestrating like this corrupt system and ruining people's lives and turning people against each other. Why is this happening? Who's doing it? And this is what you see at the end. And you get to see the forces of good. These are like hidden forces who are constantly fighting each other and trying to stop each other, but the everyday person doesn't see any of it. So it's quite a fun one. I didn't want to throw too much fantasy in, but at the same time, you run the risk of not putting enough in, and then you don't really please anybody.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the setting, because the picture that's painted is one of an environment that's really dire. Life is hard for these people.
Yeah.
What was important to you when you were creating? Because I'm sure the whole world is built out probably in your mind. What was important for you to capture, given that you were trying to write such a, as you say, a lean story?
I think the main idea is that this isn't a life. This is a fight for survival every day. And it's the reality for a lot of people in the world. And at the same time, I wanted to point out that is like, in some cases, the way people have to live their lives, like there's there's other ways that it can be done. And the way we do it is a choice. And that's what I wanted to show here. This is deliberate. And it's basically like people pitted against each other, and what the extremes of this society and the system has turned people into. And I think one of the best characters that illustrates this is a character called King, and he's a drug pusher, and he is the epitome of the system, because he only cares about one thing, which is money. And he can't remember most things, but he remembers who owes him money, and he only cares about the bottom line. And the reason why he's like this is because he grew up with nothing. And growing up with nothing, the only thing he ever wanted was to be comfortable and to have money. So that's why he's so driven to to be like that essentially. And he doesn't care about anyone else. And I think like doing things like that and sort of using tying the theme in with the characters is quite a good way of illustrating your point sometimes.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit because you've touched on a number of points, but let's kind of dive into them further. You have also written a Fantasy Writer's Handbook and you host the Fantasy Writer's Toolshed podcast. So I'd like to talk a little bit about writing fantasy. And some of these concepts will translate for people who write in other genres. And it might also be helpful for readers who enjoy, say, fantasy, things to look out for, an appreciation of what goes into the craft
Yeah.
of writing it. I want to talk about the process of writing fantasy because, as you mentioned, most stories can be weighed down by the sheer volume of characters and world building details, vocabulary, the language, the terms that are created.
Yeah.
In your experience and from talking to other writers, in your opinion, what is the kind of the most important key details to keep in mind when trying to tackle a fantasy story?
Yeah. There are a lot of challenges, and I think you pointed out a few of the big sort of problems which put a lot of readers off, I'd say, which is like the big info dumps, like really complex character names, throwing way too many terms at people too soon. Like these are all reasons why I don't like that. That puts me off fantasy sometimes. And I think there's been more of a shift now in contemporary fantasy, which I suppose it's as other genres sort of are drawn from. And there's been more of a focus on like stripping stories back, like not going into details about like the world and just focusing on just like the immediate surroundings and stuff. But I do still think there's like a big sect of fantasy fans who love the hardcore escapism. I mean, look at like Game of Thrones. Like they just bring up books now about the world, like 1,000-page tomes of just world building. So people do love it, and if you're approaching it, I always think it just depends on like what excites you most about the genre. Like when I first started writing, I loved the big plot points. So the big battles, like they were the things that stuck in my mind, and they were the ones that I would be most excited to get to and write about. Over time, I come to appreciate more that it's about characters. And for me, I always start with characters now. I might have an idea for a theme or something or a point that I want to talk about, and then I'll think about interesting characters to do that. And then I always ask, is this what would this be like in a fantasy world? Or would it work better as more of like a literary or historical thing? So if I go down the fantasy route, it's then like what kind of a world or what kind of races would work best. Like I've just been through, I don't know why, I went through a phase of just writing stories about goblins. So just loads of short stories about goblins, but I really enjoyed it, and it's quite funny because you've got your sort of archetypal goblin, the Tolkien goblin, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, let's just spin it and make them quite cultured and they're all quite laid back, but prone to bursts of anger, which can be quite destructive. So, like things like that. And one of I mean, you mentioned the podcast. Like one of the best things about doing the podcast is that you get to speak to writers, best-selling writers as well sometimes. And one of them is Adrian Tchaikovsky, and he's a brilliant world builder, and he just has a really simple technique, which is he just thinks about like a fact or something that a point that he's interested in, and then he just starts asking what if, and then just see where it takes you. So that's the simple technique, just what if.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine there is a balance that needs to be struck, or a fine line that many writers walk when writing these kinds of stories between spending time on the characters, developing them, letting you see sort of the story at the micro level to really
Yeah.
feel it and appreciate it, but also needing to hit those big plot points, get through that battle and traverse that continent and do whatever needs to happen
Yeah.
in order to advance the story. Because I'm sure it's difficult not to get bogged down in the small story, the intimate
Yeah.
story, but also not to spend so much time on these big picture things that you lose the human element,
Yeah.
the quote unquote human element in the goblin story or whatever you're writing, right? So
Yeah.
how do you keep that in your mind? How do you address that? Do you use a post-it note? Is there an alarm that goes off? Is it just you read the chapter over and think there's not enough balance here? What kind of approaches have you seen?
I mean, I tend to, when I'm editing, I tend to map the emotional journey of the characters. And if that journey is looking flat or there's not enough going on, then the character's underdeveloped. And essentially, what I mean by this is we talk a lot about this when I'm sort of teaching writing and stuff like that. And it's just, all right, this character does this, and then this happens. And then, like, how do they feel about what happens? And then, how do they respond? So, a lot of writers might do points one and two, and you do, yeah, might do a really good job of it, but it's flat because there's no emotional response. So that's what three is, and then four is basically a story. So it's like, this is what's happened to me. Right, I'm gonna do this now. And just going through and following the characters and just making sure you've done that. I think one of the problems is that you pick too many characters, and if you have too many central characters, for every central character that you add, you're looking at maybe 40,000, 30,000 words. So if you've got four main characters, you're going to be writing like a 200,000 word novel, unless they've got like shorter stories or what. So I'd just
Unless you
be
kill them off in like
careful.
the third chapter, then
Yeah,
yeah.
I think George R. Martin found that solution quite well. So, um, yeah, it's just something to be mindful of. Unless you're gonna, I mean, I like just dipping into characters' perspective sometimes. I think this is where you can strike a bit of a balance. So there'd be like a character. I've just writing a novel at the moment, and it follows one perspective for about 60% of the book, and about 30% of the way through, we see this other character, and he becomes quite a central companion. And then them two characters split up, and then you start to get his perspective. So it's almost like on a need to know basis kind of thing. Everyone's different though. It just depends what your story needs. And sometimes I think having a range of perspectives is better because you can develop suspense more. You can leave a character in one cliffhanger and skip to another character, leave them in a cliffhanger, and then go back to another character. As far as like with Game of Thrones, when I wanted to see what was going on with Tyrion, be going through chapters about Arya and Bran and all that. I was just trying to get back to the next Tyrion one.
Well, let's also talk a little bit about expectations of readers within fantasy stories. Readers have come to expect that when they see characters that or landscapes that involve men or goblins or magicians or fae or whatever, they have maybe a set of expectations that they think, okay, well, clearly the characters are going to behave like this. Is there pressure to conform to that, to do your research to understand what the lore is behind, what the history of the genre is behind these types of things, or is there really no pressure? You just write whatever you want.
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, it depends who
Mm.
you've got in mind for your audience. If you're writing more traditional fantasy, then people's expectations are a lot higher of like they expect goblins to be like Dungeons and Dragons style goblins, and that's totally fine. There's like I say, we said before, there's a lot of people who love them stories, and I love them stories as well. Like they don't really appeal to me in terms of writing, and I think there's a lot you could do about with expectations. I mean, I was speaking to a writer called Kelcade, and she wrote a series of books where the it's a chosen one story, but the chosen one gets killed in like the first chapter. So it's up to the companions then to pick up the pieces, which again, it's just like it's setting it up to be like a classic story, and then it's just going, actually, no.
Right, right,
Which is quite good. And I think fantasy, one of the best things about fantasy, I think it's the most liberating of genres because you can write any kind of story you want and just put it in a fantasy world. And as soon as you put it in a fantasy world, you've got maximum freedom then to do whatever you want. So, I mean, we've seen romantasy, and again, it's because you can take these classic romantic stories, and then do whatever you want with them. And
right,
people have got the sort of brilliant creative skill from writing these fantasy stories to put new spins on classic stories. So yeah, I
right.
think it's fantastic.
I'm curious how your writing has evolved because you've kind of alluded to that as we've been talking, but how has it changed from when you've kind of first started writing these stories till now? And then I want to talk a little bit about where you see it going. But to date, do you think there has been a shift either in how you write or what you write or your approach to writing or how you feel about what you're putting out?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, when I first started writing, it was just all enthusiasm. And then the imposter syndrome starts to kick in. And then you're like, oh no, I'm not very good at this. And then you start learning. I think the best thing, if you want to be a writer, is basically be a sponge and never accept that you're a good writer because the moment you start saying, oh, I'm a good writer, I don't need to do this, that's the moment you become a bad writer, become sloppy. And it should be a journey of continuous improvement and a quest for knowledge and betterment. So I always feel like I can write something today that's better than what I wrote yesterday, even 10 years in. And like I've got more books on writing on my bookshelves than any other type of book. I've got like two rows full of just craft books. And it's because like you've got to see so many different perspectives, so many different ways of doing things, and people explain things in different ways. And I think that's one of the most helpful things. Like theme, for example, I could never get my head around it for years and years and years. And then I read one book, and the opening chapter was about theme and premise and its role in a story, and I was just like, oh, that makes that makes sense now. So yeah, I think process does change because you become more knowledgeable, and you're one of the main things you need to learn is how you work. Like what is the most efficient way of getting the words out? And I do have quite a weird process, but I like to work in short bursts. So like, well, not short bursts, but like sessions, I call them. So if I had a full day to write, I would probably do like 4 or 5 sessions over the course of the day and have like a little breaks in between. But I would work from say 9 a.m. till like midnight and just break it up because there's different times of the day where I'm a bit more focused. And with if you're drafting stories as well, sometimes like your creative energy stores just get a bit depleted. So you need to take a step back and have a little refresh.
Right, right. And how do you feel about the editing process?
I always feel like editing is a chore.
Mm,
And to help me overcome it, I have started to work with editors a bit more. Because you get good feedback, it like keeps you sharp. And so I always do recommend if you've got a little bit of like spare cash. I mean, you can do it with short stories and it doesn't cost a lot, but you get that sort of professional input on your writing. And but yeah, editing, what I do is just take it in stages. So I will read the story once it's finished, and then look at the main points, so theme, character, conflict, plot, and then, like I said, map out all the emotional journeys for the characters, and then go back and do like line by line editing. And I probably skip too much on the beta reading, but I get impatient. But I don't think it's. I think it's definitely something worth doing. It is hard, and that's why I created a community of writers so that people could find others to exchange work with. So we all congregate on Discord if there's any writers out there looking for help. But yeah, it's that's what the process generally involves. Just a lot of polishing, looking at different things individually, and then hopefully by the end, it's not a complete mess.
Well, what about works in progress? Are you working on anything currently? And do you maintain, say, a list of things you want to write? Or do you just, when a project is done, you just wait for the next brightest, shiniest thought to come to you and that's what you explore? Like, how does it
Yeah.
work?
So I try and keep as busy as I can. Don't like to stop writing. So I'm starting to develop Patreon as more of a platform because long term I see it as probably the only sustainable way to become a full time writer. And what I've set myself as a goal is to publish a brand new story on Patreon every month. And it's also a hub for where people can find every story I've ever written and then also download ebooks of novels and short story collections and things like that. So I do have quite a lot of short story projects on the go. And what I quite enjoy doing with short stories lately is playing around with the structure. So I'm currently working on a story told through a series of negative reviews about a taxi driver. And it started as like quite a comedic idea. And I'm like, oh, he gets into this, he does this, and it's like crazy things. But then I was like, oh, I wonder, like, when you start thinking more about the character, like this taxi driver, like, what can we reveal about him and his life and what's going on from his perspective through the negative reviews of other people? And basically, there's going to be about 10 reviews, and each one, not everyone, but throughout, you'll get clues and hints that basically this fella's life's falling apart. And while he's doing these crazy things and getting into all like funny incidents because he's so stressed and distracted, and I leave it on a bit of an open ending as well. So yeah, I've quite a lot of fun playing around with structure and jumping from different projects because they're shorter. Like I'm fed up of writing novels, to be honest. They take too long, and editing them is a pain in the backside. I have got a novel that I'm about halfway through editing that I will try and finish. Like I say, it's just the projects are just too long to do,
Yeah.
and I work full time, so writing is the part time gig for now. So I just have to prioritize time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I want to double back to Together We Rise because we didn't get to talk about it, but I want to do it now. That there is a soundtrack that goes with this story. So I have two questions for you. One, what was the inspiration for doing that? Adding the musical element to a story, but you didn't have to. So the first question, why? What inspired you to do it? And then let's talk about how and what that involved.
Yeah, no problem. So when I think about the experience of readers, I'm always like I compare it to other creative work. So like TV, film, the world's become more visual. And as we become more visual, we like to take a different sound related things as well. And I always just go back to Lord of the Rings, like the movies when I was growing up. Like the soundtrack was just it made it what it was and what it is. And I still listen to the soundtrack and other similar songs when I'm writing, and because I find it so inspiring and moving. And I was like, oh, if you could enhance the experience of a reader by introducing like a sound to accompany each chapter or each character. And with this particular story, because it's a short novella and there's only 8 characters, it works so well. I think it does. You have to tie it with a character. I think we can get general sort of vibes, but for this particular story, it worked quite well. And what I wanted to do is like show or mirror the emotional journey that character goes through, in the chapter, so that some people might find it a bit more relatable, or they might find different angles that they don't pick up on from reading it. And I just thought, yeah, no one's ever done this before. It's I couldn't find any other book that had done this, and the reason why it's possible now, I mean, it is because of AI, and I did use an AI tool to do it. Now, a lot of people are a bit, obviously, it seems to be polar extremes. Like some people are in favor of AI, other people are against it. I'm more of a balanced person. Like I used 3 professional artists for Together We Rise. Spent a lot of money. Spent a lot of money on editors as well, because I value the human creativity and human skill, and that's why I chose them. For this, I couldn't afford a full orchestra to make a soundtrack, unfortunately. But I saw it as more of like a way to gain attention basically to the story, because no one's done this before and so many books are coming out. And I'm an independent publisher or independent writer. How can I stand out in a sea? And you've got technology at your disposal. And I made a few songs. I really liked the sound of them. I was really impressed. And I thought, why not just give it a go? Some people are going to hate it just for the simple fact that it's AI, and fair enough. I don't blame you. I've not used it to write the story or edit the story or any of the artwork. But for this one feature, I thought, let's give it a shot, try something new and see what impact it has.
Good. So you are out there in a lot of places on a lot of platforms. So I always ask, where can people go to find you? And I think you have a list probably of all the places where you can find we can find you. But if people are interested in learning more about you, the podcast, your Patreon page, where should they go?
You probably just Google my name because it's not very common. So, and you'll be able to find most things. But Patreon, yeah, just search for Richie Billing. That's if you like the sound of what I write, head over there. I mean, podcast is called the Fancy Writers Tool Shed. You'll find that on everything, wherever you listen to podcasts. So just have a little search for that. And richiebilling.com is the main hub. And you can find all books on there, short stories to read, and then you can also find lots of resources to help you with your writing, like fancy name generators and stuff like that. So, yeah, good place to go.
And if people want to purchase a copy of Together We Rise, where should they go to buy it?
It's available everywhere, all bookstores, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. You can get it on Patreon for cheaper than everywhere else, but that's only the ebook. But yeah, you can get it in paperback and in ebook. No audio at the moment, but I might see if there's any artists who are up for the challenge.
Up for the challenge?
Yeah, because it's 8 characters. It wouldn't be cool. I was
going to say, it's either going to
people.
be somebody a very talented voice actor, or you need 8 different people.
Yeah, get a full cast. That would be quite cool. Well, if people support me on Patreon, we can make it a reality.
Very good. Very good. Well, Richie, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Together We Rise and all the other projects you have going on. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.